There is a silence that exists only at 35,000 feet. It's not a true silence, of course. The roar of the 4 massive jet engines is a constant, physical presence, a vibration you feel in your teeth and your bones. But you learn to tune it out, until it becomes the white noise of your professional life. In that manufactured quiet, high above the weather, high above the world and all its messy problems, you can sometimes fool yourself into thinking you've escaped gravity, not just physically, but emotionally. You're untouchable. The most dangerous flight I ever made was on a day when that illusion was shattered forever. It wasn't a mission through a monsoonal front, with lightning stitching the clouds together and wind shears trying to rip the control column from my hands. It wasn't a low-level insertion into a blacked-out valley, where the ground fire looks like angry fireflies and your only thought is the silhouettes of the soldiers relying on you to get them in and out. No. The most dangerous flight was undertaken on a day of perfect, almost divine, meteorological peace. Unlimited visibility. A forecast of smooth air all the way from the dusty mountains of Afghanistan to the gentle, rolling hills of Delaware. The danger was not outside the thick, reinforced glass of the cockpit. It was inside the pressurized hull of my C-17 Globemaster III, a silent, solemn weight strapped securely to the cargo bay floor. The most dangerous flight was the one where my only piece of cargo was a ghost. The one where I, Colonel Alexander Alex Vance, had to personally oversee the loading and meticulous securing of a long, military-issue transfer case, draped in the stars and stripes, knowing that inside was the man who once held my hand and promised me the sky, and that I, the woman whose heart he'd systematically dismantled, was now the pilot who had to fly him home in a coffin. The mission order found me on a Tuesday, a day that began with the mundane rhythm of command. I was in my office at Ramstein Air Base, a functional, unglamorous space that smelled of stale coffee, jet fuel, and floor wax. The walls were a testament to my career, framed aerial photographs of mist-shrouded mountains, a map of the world dotted with pins marking deployments, my diplomas and certificates, and a single, cherished photo of my crew and me standing in front of a C-17 after a particularly hairy mission into Iraq. But the room's true soul was its window, a huge, panoramic view of the flight line. From my desk, I could watch the ballet of power and grace that was my world. The slow, elephantine taxi of a cargo plane, the frantic, buzzing energy of the fighter jets, the distant figures of ground crews looking like ants servicing giant, sleeping metal birds. It was a view of pure potential, of stories beginning and ending, of a life I had built for myself, piece by painstaking piece, a life he had never been able to envision for me, or perhaps, a life he had been actively afraid of. My executive officer, Captain Mark Davis, a good man with a sharp mind and a decent heart, knocked and entered. His face was a carefully composed mask of professional solemnity, but I'd been in the Air Force for over 20 years. I could see the subtle tension in the set of his jaw, the unspoken weight in his eyes. "Colonel Vance," he said, his voice respectfully low, cutting through the hum of my computer. He placed a single, folded piece of paper on the clear space of my desk. A personnel recovery mission. Direct order from Air Mobility Command. High priority. From Bagram, Afghanistan, to Dover, Delaware. I nodded, my hand already moving to pick up the flimsy sheet. This was the part of the job they never truly prepare you for in the glamour of flight school. The sacred, somber duty. We bring our people home. It is the one, unbreakable, non-negotiable promise the military makes. No one gets left behind. Not on the battlefield, not in a foreign hospital, not even in death. It is the final, respectful journey, a last act of service for a brother or sister in arms, a ritual of return that speaks to the very core of who we are. I unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the dry, bureaucratic language, grid coordinates, tail numbers, call signs, fuel requirements. My gaze, practiced and efficient, slid down to the section listing the human remains. And there it was. The name. The world didn't just slow, it disintegrated. It was as if all the sound had been vacuumed from the room. The familiar, thunderous roar of a F-16 taking off on afterburner just outside my window became a distant, muffled whisper, as if I were hearing it from the bottom of the ocean. My fingers, which could make micro-adjustments to a 400,000-pound aircraft in a 60-knot crosswind, now trembled so violently the paper rattled against the polished surface of my desk. Jonathan. Captain Jonathan Reed. Killed in action. Improvised explosive device. Patrol outside of Kandahar. The words were stark, black, and final. Jonathan. The name was a key, turning a lock in a deeply buried room of my heart, a room I had sealed shut, painted over, and pretended didn't exist for the better part of 2 decades. For a terrifying, disorienting moment, I was 22 again, not a 44-year-old full-bird colonel. I was back in a noisy, dimly lit university cafe, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee, old books, and the unbridled optimism of youth. I was looking into the bright, impossibly confident eyes of a boy who talked about stars and legacy as if they were his for the taking, who held my hand under the sticky, beer-stained table and traced the lines of my palm, whispering that we would conquer the world together, a team, a partnership for the ages. He promised me the sky. And God, I had believed him with every fiber of my being. I believed in us with a ferocity that felt like a fundamental truth, as undeniable as the laws of physics. We were going to be the golden couple of the Air Force. He, the brilliant strategist, the charismatic future general with a mind for geopolitics and a silver tongue. Me, the pilot, his wings, the one who would understand the gritty, tactical reality of his grand, sweeping plans. We had it all mapped out on napkins and in late-night conversations that stretched until the campus sprinklers kicked on at dawn. Colonel? Davis's voice was a hesitant blade, slicing through the fragile membrane of the past. Ma'am? Is everything all right? I forced a breath into my constricted lungs, a sharp, painful inhale that sounded more like a gasp. I willed my face into a neutral, professional mask, the one I had perfected over years of command, through engine failures and emergency landings and the constant pressure of leading young men and women in harm's way. It was the same mask I'd first learned to wear after Jonathan had systematically, and with a kind of bewildered carelessness, shattered my heart. I could not, would not, let the crack show. Not here. Not in front of one of my officers. Not in my office. It's fine, Captain, I said, my voice miraculously steady, a flat, calm lake betraying none of the seismic upheaval happening on the ocean floor below. I'll take the mission. Prepare the aircraft. I want a full pre-flight and a crew briefing in 2 hours. Let's make sure everything is perfect. Dismissed. Davis nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes before he snapped a crisp salute, did a perfect about-face, and left, the door clicking shut with a sound of terrifying finality. The silence he left behind was profound, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on me. I looked down at the order again, the black letters seeming to pulse on the page. Jonathan Reed. My Jonathan. The man who, just a few short years after those starry-eyed cafe promises, had looked at my thick, embossed acceptance letter to the Air Force Academy not with shared, bursting pride, but with a confused, deeply hurt frown, as if I had personally betrayed him. But what about us? He'd asked, his voice laced with a bewildered frustration I couldn't comprehend. What about our plan? My career track is political. I need to be in D.C. I thought you were going to get a political science degree here, stay near the capital, support my path. This changes everything, Alex. This feels like you're choosing something else over us. That was the first crack in our beautiful, fragile, hand-blown universe. The first time I realized, with a cold trickle of dread seeping into my stomach, that his promise of the sky had a very specific, unspoken condition. I was supposed to be his cheering section on the ground, the steady, supportive, earthbound partner who kept the home fires burning, who made a comfortable home for him to return to, not a fellow pilot claiming her own piece of the heavens. He wanted an astronaut's wife, not an astronaut. He wanted me to be the moon, reflecting his brilliant light, not a competing sun with my own gravity and my own solar system. I went to the academy anyway. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, a choice that felt like tearing out a part of my own soul. The fights that followed were long, bitter, and conducted over scratchy, long-distance phone lines and drafty hallways and in rushed, tense weekend visits that always, inevitably, ended in tears and recriminations. He saw my passion for flying not as a shared dream, but as a threat, a competition, a deliberate diversion from the script he had written for our lives. He couldn't understand why I needed my own cockpit, my own controls, my own wings. His sky, it turned out, was a one-man cockpit. There was only room for one. The final, devastating blow came on what should have been the pinnacle of my young life, the day of my graduation from undergraduate pilot training at Laughlin Air Force Base. I had earned my wings. After 4 years of grueling academy life and another year of the most intense, soul-testing flying training imaginable, I had done it. I stood there on the sun-baked tarmac, beaming, the silver wings heavy and glorious on my chest, a tangible symbol of every sacrifice, every doubt I'd overcome, every time I'd been told I wasn't strong enough or tough enough. He was there. He smiled for the cameras, he hugged me in front of my weeping mother, he said all the right, proud-sounding things. But that night, over an expensive, romantic dinner at the best restaurant in Del Rio, a place with white tablecloths and soft, live piano music, the facade crumbled completely. He had been offered a choice assignment at the Pentagon, a golden ticket job for a young officer with political ambitions. It was everything he'd ever wanted. And he wanted me to come with him. To request a non-flying desk job. To hang up my wings, my beautiful, hard-won wings, before I'd even really had a chance to use them. "It's time to be realistic, Alex," he'd said, his voice calm, reasonable, maddeningly so, as if he were explaining a simple mathematical equation to a slow child. "We can't both have these kinds of high-octane careers. One of us has to make a sacrifice. For us. For our future. A family, a stable home, a real life, that doesn't work with two people deployed or on different continents. My path is clearer. My trajectory is faster. This is just how it works in the military. You support me now, and later, when I'm more established, more senior, there will be time for." "Later what, Jonathan?" I'd whispered, the expensive champagne turning to vinegar in my mouth. The restaurant, with its soft lighting and clinking glasses, seemed to tilt and swim around me. "What happens later? Do I get my dreams back then? Do you magically produce a cockpit for me? Do you give me back my wings?" He never finished the sentence. He just looked at me, his expression a mixture of pity and impatience, and in that moment, I saw it all with a clarity that felt like a physical blow to the chest. There was no us in his meticulously planned, ruthlessly ambitious sky. There was only him. My dreams, my hard-won wings, my passion, my very identity, they were just set dressing, background noise in the epic, single-player story of Jonathan Reed. I remember the cold, slick feeling of the metal as I slipped the ring off my finger. It was a cheap, little silver thing he'd bought me from a street vendor during a spring break trip, a promise ring. It wasn't an engagement ring, he'd always been careful to clarify, but a promise of a promise. A placeholder for the real thing, the diamond, the security, the life, that would come when the time was right, when his career was secure. The time, I realized with a sickening lurch, was never going to be right for me. I left the ring on the table between us, a small, sad, insignificant piece of metal on the pristine white linen. I stood up, my legs shaky, and I walked out of the restaurant, my wings still pinned proudly to my dress uniform, and I walked out into the Texas night, my future in smoking ruins behind me. I cried for a week. I cried until my eyes were swollen shut and my throat was raw. Then, the grief curdled into a cold, hard, burning anger. Then, slowly, painstakingly, I got better. I became the best damn pilot I could be. I flew cargo planes across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific, then refueling tankers where precision was a matter of life and death, and finally, I earned my transition to the mighty C-17 Globemaster III, a magnificent beast of an aircraft that could carry the weight of an army and its hopes across oceans. I commanded crews, I led complex, dangerous missions into combat zones, I built a life, a full, proud, fiercely independent, and deeply satisfying life, without him. I dated, I traveled, I bought a house, I forged friendships that felt more like family. I thought I was over him. I truly did. I thought the scar tissue had grown so thick, so strong, so layered over that old wound, that it was impervious, a fortress around my heart that nothing could ever breach again. But holding that mission order, feeling the cold, bureaucratic weight of his name, his final, official designation, burn into my soul, I realized the scar was still there, thin and fragile beneath the surface, a fault line running through the bedrock of who I was, and it had just been torn wide open by a seismic event half a world away, bleeding a pain that was as fresh and sharp and debilitating as it had been 20 years ago. The pre-flight, 2 hours later, was a study in surrealism, an out-of-body experience where I watched Colonel Vance go through the motions while the ghost of Alex, the young, heartbroken cadet, screamed silently inside. I walked the familiar, ritualistic path around the massive gray hull of the C-17, my hand trailing over the cool, riveted metal, performing the checks I knew by heart, rituals that were as comforting and familiar as a childhood prayer. Check the tires for wear and pressure. Check the flaps and ailerons for freedom of movement. Check the engine cowlings for any sign of oil leakage or foreign object damage. All the while, a frantic, screaming monologue ran in a relentless loop in my head. He's in there. He's in that sterile building, in a refrigerated room, in a metal box. The boy who loved you under a blanket of stars. The man who couldn't love the pilot you became. He's in there, and you, of all the pilots in the entire United States Air Force, are the one specifically tasked with taking him on his final journey home. My crew, a mix of young, bright-eyed airmen, still fresh-faced and eager, and seasoned, taciturn NCOs, their faces etched with the wisdom of 1,000 missions, were subdued, their usual, easy banter silenced by the heavy, sacred nature of our task. They knew this was a somber, honorable mission, a final act of respect for a fallen comrade. But they didn't know the ghost sitting in the cockpit with their commander, a ghost who occupied the co-pilot's seat in my mind, his presence as palpable as the flight manual. They saw Colonel Alexander Vance, a tough, respected, somewhat intimidating pilot with a chest full of ribbons and a reputation for unshakable competence under fire. They didn't see the heartbroken girl hiding inside the Nomex flight suit, the one whose hands, tucked into her pockets, were still trembling. We took off as the sun was beginning to dip below the German horizon, setting the sky on fire with hues of deep orange, fiery red, and soft, bruised purple. A sky he had promised me. I pushed the 4 throttles forward with a practiced, steady motion, and the Pratt & Whitney engines responded with their deafening, powerful roar, a sound that vibrated deep in my chest, a feeling of raw power I never tired of. The plane, heavy with fuel and its solemn, precious cargo, lumbered down the runway, gathering speed with a determined, earth-shaking urgency, and then, with that familiar, gentle, uplifting pull that never, ever got old, we were airborne. The ground, with all its complexities and heartaches and memories, fell away, and we were climbing through the very clouds he'd once pointed to as he laid out the detailed blueprint for our shared life, a blueprint I now realized had never had a line drawn for me, only a space in the margins for my signature. The flight was long. Nearly 10 hours of unbroken darkness over the vast, black, featureless expanse of the Atlantic. The cockpit was a cocoon of quiet intensity, lit only by the soft, green and orange glow of the instrument panels, a constellation of dials and screens that were my reality now, my tangible world. My co-pilot, a major named Ben Carter with a worn photo of his wife and 2 daughters taped to his dashboard, and the loadmaster, Senior Master Sergeant David Miller, a man who had seen more of the world than most people ever would, took turns trying to make quiet, respectful small talk, offering comments about the weather, the aircraft's performance, a funny story from a past deployment. But my answers were monosyllabic, distant. My mind was 1,000,000 miles and 20 years away, lost in a past I had tried so hard to bury, a graveyard of might-have-beens and what-ifs that had just been violently exhumed. I remembered the first time Jonathan took me flying. It was a beat-up old Cessna 172, the kind with torn vinyl seats, a persistent smell of avgas and dust, and a stubborn rudder that needed constant coaxing. He was so proud, so effortlessly confident at the controls, playing the role of the experienced, worldly aviator for his impressed, landlocked girlfriend. He'd let me take the yoke for a moment over a wide, empty field in rural Virginia, and the feeling of the plane responding to my touch, the delicate pressure and counter-pressure, the world tilting and turning below me like a living, breathing map of possibilities, it was a feeling of absolute, unadulterated freedom. It was the moment I fell in love, not just with him, but with flying itself. He had given me that gift. He had been the one to open the door and show me the sheer, breathtaking joy of the sky, and then, with a cruelty born of fear and a staggering lack of imagination, he had tried to slam that door shut, to lock me out, to ground me forever in a life of secondary importance. Now, here I was, the commander of a machine that weighed over 400,000 pounds, a technological marvel that could carry tanks and troops and entire field hospitals across oceans, flying his body home. The irony was a cold, sharp, surgical knife twisting in my gut. I was the pilot now. I had the controls. I had the command. I had the final say. He was just cargo. A piece of solemn, sacred cargo, to be treated with the utmost respect and dignity, handled with gloves and prayers, but cargo nonetheless. A weight to be carried from point A to point B. A line item on my manifest. The thought was so profoundly, existentially sad that it made my chest ache with a hollow, echoing pain. About halfway through the flight, on a flimsy pretext of needing to personally verify the security of the load, I unbuckled my harness and left the controlled environment of the cockpit. I climbed down the steep, narrow ladder into the cavernous, echoing space of the cargo hold. It was mostly empty on this return leg, a vast, dark cave whose silence was punctuated only by the deep, constant, vibrational drone of the engines, a sound you felt more in your soul than heard with your ears. And there, in the very center, under the dim, red utility lights, secured to the floor with heavy, webbed straps and locked-down fittings, was the transfer case. It was draped in an American flag, the stars and stripes a stark, beautiful, heartbreaking contrast to the dull, non-skid gray of the aircraft floor. A single, silent honor guard, one of my own loadmasters, Airman First Class Jenkins, sat on a fold-down seat a respectful distance away, maintaining his vigil, his head bowed, his young face a mask of solemn duty. I stood there for a long time, my boots planted firmly on the deck, just looking at it. The flag was perfect, each fold precise, the fabric crisp and new, as if it had been waiting for this specific, tragic purpose. I thought about the young, vibrant, impossibly ambitious man who had joined the Air Force full of fire and idealism, who wanted to shape the world, to make a difference, to leave a mark. I thought about the heated, tear-filled arguments over the phone, the hurtful words spoken in frustration and fear, the final, painful goodbye in that restaurant that had left me feeling hollowed out and numb for months, a ghost walking through my own life. All of that passion, that sharp, analytical intelligence, that driving, relentless ambition, all of the desperate, all-consuming love I had felt for him, all of the searing pain he had caused, reduced to this. A metal box, strapped to the floor of my aircraft, a piece of freight on my manifest, a weight in my care. The sheer, brutal simplicity of it was overwhelming. My hand moved unconsciously, as if guided by a force older than my own will, to the wings pinned on my flight suit. My wings. The ones I'd earned without him. The ones I'd fought for, bled for, sacrificed for. The ones he'd never truly celebrated, because they represented a path that diverged from his own, a declaration of independence he could not abide. I unpinned one of them. The metal clutch was cold against my fingers. It was against every regulation, a serious breach of protocol that could, in theory, land me in a world of trouble. But this mission, this moment, had already catapulted me far beyond the realm of regulations and military decorum. This was something raw, something primal, something between the ghost of the man I'd once loved more than life itself and the woman I had been forced to become in his absence. I knelt down beside the case, the cold metal of the floor seeping through the fabric of my flight suit, a grounding chill. I looked at the flag, at the man it shrouded, at the life it represented, a life cut brutally, senselessly short in a dusty field in Afghanistan. "You promised me the sky, Jonathan," I whispered, my voice a raw, broken thread, barely audible over the omnipresent, humming roar of the engines. "You just never thought I'd be the one flying the plane. You never thought my wings would be strong enough. You never thought they'd be the ones to carry us home." I reached out, my fingers trembling again, and gently, carefully, with a reverence I didn't know I still possessed, I pinned my wing to the flag, right over the blue field of stars, directly where his heart would be. It was a final gift. A final, silent message from the woman I was to the man he had been. I made it. I earned these. I have my own sky now, and it's vast, and it's beautiful, and it's mine. It was an apology for all the ways we had failed each other, for the love that hadn't been enough to bridge the chasm between his dreams and mine. And it was a forgiveness, too, for all the pain we had caused, a release of the old, festering anger I'd carried for so long. It was a closure I never knew I needed, a ritual of letting go performed at 35,000 feet over a dark, sleeping ocean, a private funeral for the us that never was. I stood up, my knees cracking in protest, my body feeling 1,000 years old. The honor guard, Airman Jenkins, didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on a point on the far wall, granting me this private, sacred moment with a discretion that was wise beyond his years. But I saw him, in my periphery, give a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He understood. In this sacred, liminal space, hurtling through the night between a war zone and home, between the past and the present, some rules didn't apply. Some honors were beyond the manual. Some debts were paid in silence and silver wings. The rest of the flight was a blur of autopilot checks, fuel calculations, and a heavy, pervasive, but now different, silence in my own soul. We began our descent into Dover Air Force Base as the first hints of dawn began to smudge the eastern horizon with a pale, delicate, watercolor light. It was a perfect, still, almost holy morning, the air crisp and clean. The ceremony on the tarmac was brief, formal, and utterly, soul-crushingly heartbreaking in its precision and grace. A line of soldiers from the Air Force Mortuary Affairs Operations, in immaculate dress uniforms, moved with slow, precise, reverent grace, a well-oiled machine of grief and respect. They moved in unison, unlocking the heavy straps with quiet efficiency. With practiced, synchronized movements, they lifted the transfer case from my aircraft. I watched the flag, and my wing, glint in the nascent, early morning sun as they carried him, step by measured, solemn step, to the waiting mortuary affairs vehicle, a stark, white van. The silence was broken only by the scuff of their polished shoes on the asphalt and the lonely, plaintive cry of a seagull circling high overhead. I stood at rigid attention with my crew, my hand raised in a final, slow salute as they loaded him in and the van doors closed with a soft, definitive, echoing thud. I watched the vehicle drive slowly, solemnly away, its turning indicators blinking red in the dawnlight, taking Jonathan Reed to his final rest, taking my ghost with him, leaving me standing on the tarmac, strangely, profoundly empty, but also, for the first time in 2 decades, completely free. I never told anyone on my crew who he was to me. That story was mine alone to carry, my private ghost to finally lay to rest. They just thought their commander was particularly moved by the inherent tragedy of the mission, by the loss of a young captain with his whole life ahead of him. And I was. The loss of any service member is a tear in the fabric of our world. But it was so much more than that. It was the end of a story that had been left unfinished for 20 years. The flight back to Ramstein, the aircraft now empty and light, felt different. I felt lighter, too, as if a weight I had been carrying for 2 decades, a weight I had become so accustomed to I no longer even noticed it, had been unstrapped and left on that tarmac in Dover. The ghost was gone. I had faced the greatest pain of my past, strapped it down, and flown it through the long, dark night. I had looked my broken heart in the face, in the form of a flag-draped casket, and I had done my duty, not just as a colonel and a pilot, but as a human being who had once, deeply and completely, loved the man inside it. I still have my career. I still have my wings, though one set is now forever missing, a part of my story given back to its source. The sky is still my home, my office, my cathedral. But that flight, that specific, painful, redemptive journey, changed me in a fundamental way I am still unraveling. It taught me that the hardest journeys aren't measured in nautical miles or flight hours, but in the immense, silent, terrifying distance between who you were and who you have to become to survive, to thrive. Jonathan promised me the sky, but he couldn't give it to me. A promise like that can never be fulfilled by someone else. It's not a gift to be given, but a realm to be claimed. I had to earn it for myself. I had to build my own wings, navigate my own storms, and find my own way through the clouds. And in the end, the only way to finally, truly let him go, to release the ghost of the boy from the cafe and the man from the Pentagon, was to be the one to carry him home. The man who wanted to give me the stars ultimately became the weight that taught me how to fly alone, and in doing so, taught me the most valuable lesson of all, that I always could.